On his father's momentous 60th birthday, surrounded by over 50 guests gathered in the spacious living room, a scene unfolded that would forever be etched in Elias's memory. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and the shimmer of champagne, the festive atmosphere suddenly gave way to a chilling revelation. His father, with a cynical smirk, raised his glass and declared, "Elias, you are adopted, and your name has been struck from my will." The reaction was immediate. A burst of laughter shook the room. Relatives, doubled over in fits of amusement, slapped each other on the back as if Elias's humiliation were part of the entertainment. His younger brother Victor stood out, his smug grin directed squarely at Elias. His sister Clara, feigning pity, leaned in to a cousin, exchanging cutting remarks that triggered another explosion of laughter. Their father, Richard, basked in the attention, savoring every second of the cruel spectacle. The only person who did not share in the general merriment was his mother, Marion. Frozen in her armchair, she clutched the tablecloth convulsively, as if trying to hold herself steady during a storm. Her eyes, filled with silent apology, met Elias's gaze, but she uttered no words, as always avoiding public confrontations with her husband, even when her adopted son was the target. Elias, feeling a searing pain in his chest but refusing to succumb to the humiliation, strode purposefully forward through the laughter. Each step he took was deliberate and confident. As he approached the long banquet table laden with gifts, the laughter gradually subsided. Without a word, Elias placed his gift on the polished surface of the table. Unlike the others, his gift was not wrapped in bright paper or tied with a ribbon. It was a simple envelope. Under the watchful eyes of those present, he slid the envelope to the center of the table and tore it in half, then continued to rip it into smaller and smaller pieces until they were scattered fragments across the tablecloth. After this, with an unflappable expression, he stepped back, observing the astonishment that swept through the room. "What the hell was that?" his father suddenly bellowed, trying to maintain a confident tone, but a tremor was audible in his voice. Those present, who moments earlier had been laughing at Elias, now stared curiously at the torn pieces of paper, their cruelty replaced by bewilderment. Elias, looking his father directly in the eyes, replied in a level voice that was audible to everyone, "That was my gift to you." Elias grew up in a household where wealth was measured not only by money, but also by pride, appearance, and lineage. His father, Richard, had built his reputation on these values. In the public eye, he was a successful businessman, a man who had built his empire through determination and shrewd deals. But to Elias, he was a man who never missed an opportunity to remind him of his adopted status. In his youth, Elias tried to ignore the difference in how he was treated compared to his brother and sister. Victor, 2 years younger, inherited his father's sharp chin and confident stride. Clara, 3 years older, possessed his cunning smile and authoritative nature. They were their father's pride. Richard loved to introduce them at parties, praise their achievements, and boast about their brilliant futures. With Elias, it was different. He rarely introduced him as his son, and when he had to, he emphasized the word adopted, as if it were a warning. During family dinners, he often ignored Elias's accomplishments, even though Elias worked harder than Victor and Clara combined. When Elias received a scholarship to college, his father congratulated him with the same dry tone he used to thank a waiter for refilling his wine glass. Elias's only support in that house was his mother, Marion. She was gentle, quiet, and always tried to shield him from his father's cruelty. She wasn't his biological mother either, but she never made him feel like an outsider. As a child, she would often come into his room at night, sit on the edge of his bed and whisper, "You are mine, Elias. Blood has nothing to do with it." These words sustained him for years when he felt like an outcast, was ridiculed, and treated as if he didn't belong to this family. Despite Elias's best efforts, it was hard for him to watch his father shower Victor with attention, barely noticing him. It was especially painful to see Richard raise a triumphant toast to Clara's debate competition victory, while Elias's achievements in business school went unacknowledged. By the time he was 30, he had given up hope for his father's recognition. Elias built his own career, invested wisely, and secured a decent life for himself without relying on his father's wealth or influence. He didn't need his father's money. Elias yearned only for respect, even a shred of acknowledgement that he wasn't just an outsider his father loved to taunt. When the invitation for Richard's 60th birthday arrived, Elias almost ignored it. The invitation, penned in Clara's elegant script and adorned with gold lettering, exuded the luxury that was always an integral part of their family gatherings. The celebration was to be held at the family estate, a mansion that served as a monument to Richard's success. The guest list included distant relatives, old friends, and business partners. It was more than just a birthday. It was a display of achievements. Elias hesitated, but Marian personally called him. "Please come, Elias," she softly pleaded. "It would mean a lot to me if you were there. Your father? Well, he's stubborn in his own way, but you are still his son, no matter what he says. Just be there for me." There was a weight in her voice that Elias couldn't ignore. She had been his protector for as long as he could remember, and if she asked him, he couldn't refuse. Elias promised himself to remain calm, no matter what his father did. On the day of the party, Elias arrived early. The house glittered with chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white uniforms glided silently across the floor with trays of champagne, and laughter already echoed through the rooms. He walked past portraits of Richard shaking hands with politicians, posing in front of his first company, and smiling with Victor and Clara at important events. Not a single photograph with Elias adorned these walls. Marian met him at the door. She hugged him tightly, and he smelled her familiar lavender scent. "You look wonderful," she said proudly, straightening his tie as if he were still a boy. Behind her, Elias saw Richard talking to Victor near the bar. His loud laughter filled the room. Clara stood nearby, sipping champagne, her sharp gaze scanning the guests like a hawk searching for prey. Marian whispered, "Promise me, Elias, that you won't let him get to you tonight. Just smile, nod, and let the evening pass." Elias nodded, though a part of him knew that no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, his father would find a way to make him a target of his cruelty. It was a role Richard had assigned him in this family drama, and he played it with relish. Throughout the evening, Elias politely conversed with guests, shook hands, and listened to empty compliments from relatives who barely knew him. The air was filled with the scent of expensive wine and roasted lamb, but beneath that, something more lingered: power, control, and a constant reminder that this was Richard's stage, and everyone present was expected to applaud him. In his pocket, Elias held a small envelope, a gift for his father. Unlike the luxurious watches and rare wines piled on the gift table, his present was simple and modest, yet far more valuable than anything else in the room. Elias had chosen it carefully, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Despite everything, he wanted to give his father something meaningful. Watching Richard interact with friends, basking in the glow of his own importance, Elias felt the weight of the envelope pressing against his chest. He didn't know then how quickly everything would change, and how this simple piece of paper would shatter Richard's empire of arrogance in the eyes of everyone he sought to impress. After dinner, the speeches began. Waiters cleared plates, the clinking of cutlery faded, and silence fell over the room. Everyone knew that Richard loved being the center of attention more than anything, and his birthday was the perfect occasion for it. He stood at the head of the long banquet table, glass held high and chest puffed out, as if the entire evening were dedicated to his grandeur. Richard tapped his glass lightly, silencing scattered whispers and laughter. Muted voices and soft laughter hung in the air, creating a celebratory atmosphere. The birthday celebrant began his speech, his voice confident, like a man accustomed to attention. He spoke of 60 years of tireless work, building a strong family, and forging a legacy worthy of remembrance for generations to come. The assembled guests applauded politely, expressing their admiration with nods. Some raised their glasses, caught up in the rhythm of his speech. Victor, the speaker's son, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin, proud of his position beside his father. Clara, Victor's wife, gently placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining with reflected glory. Only Marian, the speaker's wife, sat tense, her smile appearing thin and fragile, like glass about to shatter at any moment. His father's speech continued, filled with tales of his early business ventures, triumphs over rivals, and his unwavering determination to leave behind a thriving empire. Each story was met with laughter from the audience and approving nods from relatives eager to stay in his good graces. Suddenly, the tone of his voice shifted. He lowered his glass slightly and smirked mysteriously. "But what is a legacy without blood?" he uttered, his words like sharp arrows meant to pierce the hearts of his listeners. He paused, allowing them time to grasp the meaning of what he had said before continuing. "A man's legacy belongs to his children, those in whom his blood flows, who bear his name and share his spirit." A murmur of agreement swept through the room, heads nodded approvingly, and smiles widened. Inside, Elias's stomach tightened with foreboding. He knew where his father was leading. His father's gaze fixed on Elias, like a predator stalking its prey. "This brings me to a decision I have made," he stated, savoring the silence, then declared with cruel satisfaction, "My adopted son, Elias, will not be included in my will. A legacy cannot be passed through documents. It must flow in the blood." For a moment, silence reigned in the hall, as if time had stopped. Then laughter erupted. Loud, cruel, unrestrained laughter. Guests snickered, covering their mouths with their glasses. Some slapped the table as if they had heard the funniest joke of their lives. Victor laughed loudest of all, slapping his father on the back and exclaiming, "Well done, Dad. It's about time you made things clear." Clara smirked and shook her head, as if she had always expected this outcome. A flush of anger rushed to Elias's face, burning him from within. He watched as these people laughed at him, at his life in this family, at the years spent trying to prove his worth. His fists clenched under the table, but he would not give them the pleasure of seeing his weakness. Marion did not laugh. She sat motionless, gripping the stem of her wineglass so tightly it seemed about to snap. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back, unwilling to show her pain before the crowd. She looked at Elias, and her gaze held a mixture of sadness and apology, as if she was begging him not to give in to anger. A storm raged within Elias. Every insult, every slight, every reminder from his father that he was merely an adopted son raced through his mind. This was his father's final act, a public declaration that Elias did not belong to this family, and he wanted the world to witness this humiliation. The laughter continued, echoing off the high ceilings and filling the luxurious room with cruelty. Some guests felt uncomfortable but still laughed, unwilling to contradict Richard's authority. Elias caught the eye of an old family friend, a man who had known him since childhood. He quickly looked away, ashamed to be caught enjoying the spectacle. Elias could have left. That would have been the easiest solution. To leave them alone with their celebration of blood and wealth, to let them think they had forever erased him from their lives. But something inside him hardened. He would not leave quietly. Not tonight. He pushed back his chair and stood up. The laughter died down as he walked towards the long banquet table where the gifts were piled. His footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Even Victor stopped laughing, his smirk fading as he watched Elias. His father raised his chin, trying to appear indifferent, but Elias caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. His gaze was superior. "And where do you think you're going?" His voice rang out, still tinged with mockery, but with an underlying tension that cut through the oppressive silence, as if it pressed against the walls of the room. Ignoring his words, Elias focused his gaze on the small envelope clasped in his hand. This humble gift, devoid of any extravagance, seemed more precious than the mountain of luxurious presents piled on the table. He carefully placed the envelope in the center of the table, and the sound of paper meeting wood was unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Dozens of eyes followed his every move as he straightened up. Without a single word, he held the envelope high above his head, displaying it to everyone present, then decisively tore it in half. A gasp of astonishment rippled through the room. He continued to tear the paper into smaller and smaller pieces, allowing them to drift gracefully, like snowflakes, onto the polished surface of the table. Having completed his act, he let the scraps fall from his hands and turned to face his father. The mocking expression had vanished from his father's face, replaced by bewilderment. Richard's smirk faded, his jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed, trying to comprehend what he had just destroyed. "What was that?" he demanded an answer, his voice sharp with a hint of nascent fear. "What the hell did you just tear up in front of everyone?" Elias met his father's gaze, and for the first time in his life felt no fear of him. His voice was level and clear, so that every guest in the room could hear him. "That was my gift to you." A heavy silence fell. The same people who had been laughing at him just minutes before now leaned forward curiously, wondering what they had just witnessed. His father's face showed anger, but behind the bravado, Elias noticed the first signs of confusion. He didn't yet realize what he had lost, but he soon would. The scraps of the gift still lay scattered on the table, fluttering slightly in the draft from the air conditioner. Silence descended upon the room, broken only by the soft hum of the chandeliers overhead. He felt every gaze in the room fixed on him. Some were wide with astonishment, others narrowed with curiosity. The laughter that had filled the house moments ago had completely died out, leaving behind an oppressive feeling that weighed on everyone present. His father was the first to break the silence. "Elias," he said slowly, lowering his voice, "what did you just do?" The smug expression had vanished from his face, his brow furrowed, his lips thinned into a tight line, and for the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. Elias stood tall, letting his father stew in discomfort. "I gave you my gift," he replied calmly, "and I made sure you could never keep it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads turned, whispers filled the edges of the room. People shifted in their chairs, their curiosity sharp, eager to know what he meant. Victor leaned forward, snorting loudly to cover his unease. "Oh, please," he sneered. "What could you possibly give that would matter here? Dad doesn't need anything from you. This is just another one of your pathetic attempts for attention." Clara smirked, tilting her head with the same arrogant look she had mastered since childhood. "Pathetic, really? Even on his birthday, you still make it about yourself." He ignored them both. They always played their roles as their father's loyal shadows, echoing his cruelty and relishing the approval it brought them. His words were not for them, but for Richard. His father moved closer to the table, his eyes narrowed, staring at the pile of torn paper. He tried to sound authoritative, but a slight tremor betrayed his voice. "Pick that up and explain yourself right now." He shook his head. "No, Dad. You wanted to show everyone tonight that I don't belong to this family. You wanted to humiliate me in front of the people who matter most to you, but you don't understand that I came prepared." A gasp swept through the crowd. A woman in the back covered her mouth with her hand. A man urgently whispered something to his neighbor. The tension in the room shifted. This was no longer entertainment. This was a confrontation, and no one wanted to miss a second. Marion's eyes welled with tears as she looked at him. She reached out a trembling hand towards him, as if to stop him, but uttered no words. She had spent years keeping the peace, but in this moment, she realized something had changed. A tense silence hung in the air, a prelude to a storm. Richard's chin, as if carved from stone, expressed his fury. "Prepared for what?" he thundered, demanding an answer. I met his gaze, unflinching under the weight of his anger. "Prepared for you, for this evening," I replied calmly. "You can laugh, disinherit me, shout to the world about the power of blood, but you won't erase what I just destroyed." A whisper rippled through the room, like a gust of wind. Victor, who had remained composed until this moment, frowned, realizing that something extraordinary was happening. "What was in that envelope?" he asked, and for the first time uncertainty crept into his voice. I savored the moment, watching his anxiety like a wildfire spread among those present. Just recently my father's friends, generously showering him with smiles and laughter, now leaned forward anxiously. Business partners, usually self-assured, shifted in their chairs, understanding that what was unfolding was far from the display of power Richard intended to create. Finally, I spoke. It was a legal document, transferring ownership of something valuable, something you would appreciate, something I wanted to give you. I paused, looking my father directly in the eyes. But I tore it up. And with it, I destroyed the only gift in this room that truly mattered. The blood drained from his face. He stepped towards the table, as if hoping to determine from the scraps of paper what document had been destroyed. His hand instinctively reached for them, but pride prevented him from humiliating himself in front of the guests. Victor's voice trembled as he choked out, "What property? What was it?" All his bravado vanished. He shifted his gaze from me to his father, realizing for the first time that he might not have been the favorite son in all respects. Clara crossed her arms, trying to maintain an air of composure. "He's bluffing. There was nothing in there. He just put on this show for drama." But her eyes betrayed her doubt. Richard turned back to me, his voice now laced with demanding urgency. Tell me what you destroyed, now! I shook my head, my voice calm but firm. You'll find out soon enough, but not from me. You'll see for yourself when you piece all the scraps together. The tension in the room reached its peak. Some guests, feeling awkward, shifted in their chairs, wanting to leave but unable to tear themselves away from the unfolding drama. Others, on the contrary, leaned forward, eagerly watching the climax of the performance. Richard couldn't take it anymore. He lunged at the table, sweeping the scraps of paper into his hands. His movements were frantic, almost desperate. He snapped at Victor and Clara. "Help me find the rest, immediately!" Victor, without hesitation, rushed to obey, picking up scraps from the floor. Clara hesitated, glancing at the guests, embarrassed by what was happening, but eventually, she too knelt to gather the fragments. At that moment, Marion quietly rose from her seat and approached me. Her hand gently touched mine, and her whisper, barely audible, resonated louder than a shout for me. "You are not weak. You never were." I felt a surge of strength rise within me. For years I had been treated as an outcast, an unworthy son. But now, in front of everyone, the balance of power was shifting. My father was no longer the one in control. He had become a man desperately trying to piece together what I had destroyed. The guests watched in stunned silence as the mighty Richard, a man who had demanded respect his entire life, bent over a pile of torn paper, his hands trembling as he tried to put it back together. He had turned my humiliation into his own, and in that moment I knew that whatever happened next, it would change not only his perception of me, but everything else. My father's hands trembled as he pressed the paper scraps onto the table. Victor bustled beside him, trying to join the edges with strips of clear tape. Clara smoothed out tiny fragments, her face pale but determined to maintain composure. Their movements were hasty, clumsy, and desperate. The same guests who had been laughing moments ago now sat in complete silence, watching the proud patriarch of the family flail like a drowning man. The sound of tape tearing echoed unnaturally loudly in the quiet room. My father's face glistened with sweat, his jaw was clenched, and his lips whispered curses as he tried to bring order to the torn pieces. His reputation, his authority, his image as an all-powerful man, all of it crumbled before the eyes of those from whom he demanded the most respect. The solemn atmosphere of the evening reached its climax. Finally, fragments of words began to form a coherent whole. Neatly aligned strips of paper revealed black ink printed on official letterhead. The invited guests, holding their breath, craned their necks curiously, whispering among themselves as they realized what their father held in his hands. Richard ceased his meticulous reassembly, his gaze frantically scanning the fragmented phrases, and his breathing quickened as the truth became evident. In his hands was a legally binding deed of transfer of ownership, notarized and fully valid. This document granted him ownership of one of his son's most valuable assets, a commercial building located in the heart of the city, worth millions. Elias had intended this gesture as a sign of respect, a way to show his father that, despite everything, he still valued him as a parent. This envelope contained more than just an expensive gift. It held a timid attempt at reconciliation. However, by tearing the document in front of the astonished audience, Elias immediately revoked his gift. The property was no longer destined for his father. He had lost it even before he could realize he might have possessed it. Richard's face paled as the realization hit him. His hands froze in midair, the reassembled paper fragments he held trembling. The room erupted in whispers, cutting and insistent. "It was a deed of gift," someone hissed in astonishment. "He was going to give him the building," another voice added, "and now it's all gone, just like that." Victor's mouth dropped open in involuntary amazement. "You were actually going to give him that building?" His voice quivered with disbelief. "It was supposed to be ours." Anger contorted Victor's face as he turned to Elias. "You betrayed us. You orchestrated all of this to humiliate him." The mask of smug superiority that Clara wore instantly shattered. She stared at the taped-together scraps of paper, her jaw slack, her confidence evaporated without a trace. For the first time that evening, she looked bewildered and vulnerable. Richard's voice, low, hoarse, and devoid of the authoritative power he had exuded all evening, broke through the rising whispers. "Why, Elias? Why did you do this?" Elias stepped forward, his steady voice echoing through the room. "Because you never saw me as your son. Today, You wanted to make that public. You wanted to strike me from your will, as if I had never existed in this family. So, I decided to show you what it feels like to lose what you believed was rightfully yours. This building was yours, Father. I offered it to you, but I took it back the very moment you tried to erase me from your life." A gasp of astonishment swept through the room. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, feeling ashamed of the laughter they had joined in earlier. Others sat as if paralyzed, watching the downfall of a man they had admired. Tears welled in Marion's eyes as she reached out a hand to Elias. She said nothing, but her face shone with both pride and sorrow. Richard's hands released the taped scraps. They scattered across the table once more, becoming useless debris. His shoulders slumped. The fight had left him. He had lived his life believing his strength lay in control, wealth, and lineage. In one swift moment, Elias had shattered that illusion. "You think this makes you strong?" he finally spat out, though his voice trembled. "You think tearing up a piece of paper changes anything?" "It changes everything," Elias replied, "because that paper wasn't just a deed of ownership. It was proof that I cared about you, even after everything you did to me. I wanted you to have something meaningful, something that said I was still willing to be there for you as your son. But you cast me aside in front of everyone, so I destroyed the one chance you had to keep me in your life." The ensuing silence was deafening. Elias's words hung in the air, undeniable and final. Victor slammed his fist on the table furiously, his anger bursting forth. "You ruined everything," he shouted. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Elias calmly turned to him. "I know exactly what I've done. I showed you that wealth doesn't buy loyalty, and blood ties don't guarantee love. You wanted me gone, erased, forgotten. But tonight, you will remember me every time you see what your father lost." Clara said nothing. She leaned back in her chair, hugging herself tightly, her composure shattered. Richard stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the torn fragments of the deed. His face was pale, his hands hung limply by his sides. For the first time in his life, Elias saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of the truth. Richard had built his world on dominance and outward show, and in one night, that world had collapsed before the eyes of everyone he had striven to impress. A heavy silence descended. The invited guests began to whisper, and some started to rise from their seats, no longer wishing to remain in the company of a man whose disappointment was so evident. The glances directed at Elias expressed a spectrum of emotions, from respect to disbelief, but none of them any longer held the admiration once reserved for Richard. Having made his final decision, Elias turned toward the exit. "Happy birthday, Father," he said in a level, almost gentle voice. "Enjoy the gifts from those who secretly mock your cruelty. My gift was my respect, which you believed was rightfully yours, but which is now lost forever." As he left, he heard the scrape of chairs being pushed back, the rising whispers, and the sound of his father slumping into his armchair. The man who had spent his life towering over others now seemed pathetic, powerless, and broken. With a straight back and confident strides, Elias exited the dining room, followed by a wave of whispers. The guests gathered to celebrate Richard's triumph now quietly discussed his downfall. The man who had laughed at him, who had treated him like a shadow in his own home, now sat pale and trembling before his entire world. Elias did not look back, for the first time in his life not needing his reaction to validate his actions. In the spacious hall, the golden lights of the chandeliers reflected off the polished marble. But the house no longer felt like a fortress of fear, only a shell of Richard's inflated ego. Marion's soft footsteps approached him. Grabbing his hand, she whispered in a trembling but firm voice, "Elias, I'm proud of you. I wish it hadn't come to this, but you finally showed him who you really are." Turning to the woman who had been his rock throughout his life, he replied, "I did it for myself, Mom. Not to hurt him, but so he could finally see what he lost." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "You were always the strongest. He just never wanted to admit it." She hugged him tightly, and he allowed himself to lean into her, not as an outcast, but as the son she had always loved unconditionally. Stepping outside, he felt the cool night air, like a breath of freedom. The estate behind him still glittered with lights, but the festivities inside were already crumbling. He knew this story would spread throughout the community. Guests would forget the exquisite food and expensive wines, but they would forever remember Richard, frantically sifting through scraps of paper, his pride trampled as easily as that deed. In the days that followed, numerous phone calls came. Some relatives called, their voices full of false sympathy. "Elias, you shouldn't have done that in front of everyone," one aunt admonished, as if his father's public humiliation was acceptable, but his response was not. He quickly ended those conversations, no longer needing the approval of those who had joined in the mockery. Others called with respect, their voices hushed, almost reverent. "You did what no one dared," one of his father's old business partners said. "You stood up to him. You showed his human side." They admired the strength he displayed, though admiration was never his goal. He sought peace, but if peace was not possible, then truth would suffice. Victor avoided him entirely. From distant relatives, Elias learned that Victor was furious that he had deprived him and Clara of what they considered their rightful due. For Victor, this act symbolized not only wealth, but also status, another inheritance stolen by a brother he had never considered his equal. Clara, however, sent a short message: "You got what you wanted, don't come back here." He smiled when he read it, as he had no intention of returning. His father never called. Weeks passed, then months, but there was no word from him. His pride would not allow him to acknowledge his loss. He had built his life on control, and Elias had shattered that illusion before the only audience that mattered to him. He preferred to languish in silence than to face him again. But one afternoon, Marion quietly visited him. She brought a basket of freshly baked bread, the same kind she used to bake when he was a boy. She sat at his kitchen table, her hands folded, her face softened by sadness and peace. "He's not the same," she said. "He spends most nights in his study, staring at the wall. He's not angry, he's just diminished, as if the weight of his own decisions has finally caught up to him." Elias listened silently. A part of him felt pity, but another part understood that he was not responsible for his father's regrets. "He had sought my complete oblivion," I recalled, but in the end, he only revealed his true nature to those around him. Marion, in a gesture of support, touched my hand. She emphasized that I was not just his son, but an independent individual who had proven it not with shouts or cruelty, but with my actions. This distinction, she believed, made me different. For a long time, I thought strength lay in patiently enduring his contempt, in waiting for recognition that never came. However, true strength lay in breaking free from his shadow and creating my own life, where my worth did not depend on his approval. As time went on, I directed my efforts into my own projects, expanding my business and providing opportunities for those who, like me once, had been overlooked. I became a mentor to young people who were told they didn't belong, reminding them that family and worth are defined not by blood ties, but by choice and character. Each of their successes filled me with a pride my father could never understand. Memories of that night never faded. Sometimes I revisited them in my thoughts, but no longer with bitterness, but with clear understanding. I remembered his cruel laughter, Victor's and Clara's arrogant faces, the silence of the guests who did not support me. But I also remembered how quickly everything changed when I stood firm and let my actions speak louder than their contempt. The lesson was simple, yet it carried the wisdom of life experience. Family is defined not by a will or blood relation, but by love, respect, and support in moments when the world tries to break you. I found that in Marion, and just as importantly, in myself. That was enough. On my father's next birthday, I chose not to attend. I spent the evening with friends who had become my true family, people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them. We laughed heartily, not at the expense of others, but from joy and gratitude. And when the candles were blown out, I realized I no longer carried the burden of his rejection. That night, I understood that walking away was not defeat, but victory. The man who tried to erase me was left with nothing, while I found freedom. This was the truth of that night when my father tried to destroy me. He thought his words would break me, but they only set me free. I left his house, no longer seeking his approval or yearning for a place in his shadow. I understood that strength lies not in the recognition of those who refuse to see your worth, but in the ability to stand tall even when the world tries to break you.